Good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you're all well. I'm James Kelly from Pluto Press, and I'm delighted to be joined by tonight's speakers. Longtime Pluto author, activist, and founding member of the One Democratic State campaign, Jeff Halper, and journalist and commentator Yasmin Alibi-Brown, who will be chairing tonight's event. First off, a big thanks to the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions for co-hosting this event. Tonight, we're here to discuss Jeff's new book, which is available now. Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. This book explores how the concept of settler colonialism provides a clear understanding of the Zionist movement and the displacement and oppression of Palestinians. For those of you who haven't yet, you can head over to plutobooks.com to pick up a copy of the book. We have other offers on our website available now, including our January super sale with selected books available for just £4. And 40% off books on our Art and Resistance reading list. Remember to like and share the link to this event and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This event is also going to feature a Q&A section, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Now I'd like to hand it over to Linda from ICAD to say a few words.
Sorry, thank you, James, and thanks all at Pluto Press. On behalf of ICAD UK and the ICAD chapters in Finland, Germany, and the US, I'm delighted to welcome all those who have joined this webinar. ICAD was founded in 1997. Our focus for mobilization is Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes. Over the years, ICAD supporters physically resisted demolitions, confronted bulldozers and the Israeli army. ICAD has rebuilt 200 Palestinian homes as nonviolent political resistance to Israel's occupation. This is a significant number of direct actions, but a drop in the bucket when you consider that more than 55,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished in the occupied territory of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Israel uses a system of zoning and planning to justify its actions, which ICAD has contested with Palestinians going all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court, which ruled against Palestinians, yet again demonstrating that even in Israeli courts, they deem themselves above international law. Israel's aim all along has been to make life so difficult for Palestinians that they leave. In Israel's early years, beginning in 1948, more than 530 Palestinian villages and towns were destroyed, which resulted in the demolition of 62,000 Palestinian homes. And yet, even today, Israel continues to demolish homes within the state of Israel of its Palestinian citizens, which is a demonstration of ongoing racism and an apartheid policy. ICAD's campaign for home demolitions is at the very center, countering Zionist agenda to get as much land of historic Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians. Significantly, from the very beginning, ICAD has taken a political stance. ICAD looks at the big picture and calls for a just and sustainable solution for people on both sides of the divide. In the early years, we spoke of conflict, ending the occupation, and the two-state solution. But soon ICAD realized that there was much more to this as we grew in understanding. This meant ICAD's rhetoric changed. This has brought ICAD to our position of identifying Israel as an apartheid state, the end now of settler colonialism, which we've seen because of the Judaization of all of historic Palestine. In this desire to change history, well, really, it's what has attracted me to ICAD. During the last year, systematic issues of injustice came right to the fore. Many of these issues, including the Palestinian struggle, have their roots in colonialism. Peoples of the world seek equality and they're rising up. And so we're going forward, building a movement, and we very much hope that you will be joining us in this struggle. You know, for this, we need visionaries, leaders for the struggle. I believe that Jeff Halper is amongst them. And that brings me to introducing our guest speakers for this evening. Dr. Jeff Halper is in the unique position of being able to combine his academic background with social justice activism. Jeff gained his PhD in anthropology and taught at universities in Israel, in the States, and in Costa Rica. Jeff has published hundreds of articles, and his books include Between Redemption and Revival, Obstacles to Peace, An Israeli in Palestine, War Against the People, and now his new book. Jeff's activism began during the civil rights movement in the States and has continued throughout his life. Jeff is a former Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and 3 years ago, he was invited to be part of the core team for the establishment of the One Democratic State campaign. Jeff will be interviewed by Yasmin Alibi Brown. Yasmin was born in Uganda, but left for Britain shortly before the expulsion of Ugandan Asians by Idi Amin. Yasmin has gone on to become a prominent political and social commentator, a journalist, an author, and an Orwell Prize and National Press Awards winner. Currently, she's a regular columnist for the Eye, a feature writer for the Sunday Times Magazine, and the editor of Bite Back's Provocation series. Yasmin Alibi Brown interviewed Jeff Halper at one of ICAD UK's annual conferences, so they've met before. Anyway, now it is my pleasure to call upon Yasmin and Jeff to begin their discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Hi, Jeff. It's wonderful to. I can't see Jeff, but I hope he can hear me.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Good to see you again. And I just want to say before we begin the interview that it is Holocaust Memorial Day today. And, you know, I have been thinking about it a lot the whole day. And it's a history that should never be forgotten, in my view, sometimes. Like so often, history becomes used and abused, but I do wish to remember that it is this day. And just in briefly in passing, when I was homeless after what happened in Uganda and had no money, a wonderful Jewish scientist from Berlin who had lost almost all his family, called Hugh Blashko, offered me a home in his house in Oxford, rent-free. And I was there for 7 years with him. And he became my mentor, everything. And he always said to me one thing, because I was very pro-Israel at the time. And he used to say to me, be happy, you have no homeland. Israel will bring out the worst in us. And I always remember his words, and I've mentioned them in one of my books. So your book again reminded me of so much what Hugh believed in, which was equality, civility, human rights, one humanity. But this is a life-changing book, Jeff. If for no, you know, for all kinds of reasons, your language, how you describe one of the most persistent situations in world history, how your language itself gives us a way of disrupting that bad history. And, just look at it through the lens of decolonization, I think is not only right, but incredibly important for everybody. So thank you. It's always humbling to read your stuff, and I have read it, but this book, and it's written in a very accessible way. So my first question, I suppose, is, did you deliberately write this book so that it could be read by anybody and understood by everybody?
Well, thank you, Yasmin, and thank you, Pluto and Linda and everyone for having me here today. Yeah, the book is I mentioned even in the book is more than just an academic book. Hopefully, it is written accessibly. I tried very hard to write it in a way that the average layperson could read, and I don't think I succeeded in that. There's even a program on the internet that's called Hemingway, where you put your sentences in, and it tells you how to make them as simple as Hemingway wrote his sentences, which I think helped. I actually did that. It was good because for an academic, you can go on and on and on, and it's jargony and so on. So I really did consciously try to do that. I think my writing is clear academic writing, but I haven't managed, I guess, from my point of view at least, to go over that hump to more popular writing. So I think it's important. The book I think is important because it sets out the whole idea of settler colonialism and Zionism and how to get out of this mess through decolonization and so on. But I'm really aware of the problem that settler colonialism and decolonization are not easy terms for people to understand. Like, people sort of know colonialism, so they know the British and India. But settler colonialism is already getting into a very fine type of colonialism and it sounds very academic. And then you talk about decolonization and people just throw up their hands. In other words, apartheid or occupation or conflict are easier things for people obviously to get. So one of the problems that I think we have, and I hope my book makes a certain contribution, is to find a way to present these complex ideas in this analysis in a way that is accessible to people. It's never going to be a soundbite, which is a disadvantage for us, but nevertheless, the concepts are very important. And I really found, the more I got into the settler colonial analysis, which actually is very developed in the academic world. There's journals of settler colonialism. There's 100 articles, or thousands of articles. It hasn't yet penetrated into the popular discourse. So hopefully, I'm able to kind of convey that analysis, because it really does open up all kinds of possibilities of resolving this in a way that the term conflict doesn't. Conflict locks us into a particular kind of a conflict resolution mode that's never worked. Settler colonialism really opens things up and lets us get to a genuine resolution.
And you're absolutely right, but you've also brought the book at a moment when actually decolonization is being discussed by young people in particular. In this country, in the United States, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, as you quote Mahmoud Mamdani, who I knew at university in Uganda, who says the decolonization of the mind. So your decolonization, I would say to you, is beginning to be understood. And I also think that the examples you gave of settler colonialism were so meaningful. It's just that people haven't thought about it. So, when you describe the South African, the South America, Australia, and so on as settler colonialism, it completely opened my eyes to it, that of course,
Mhm.
It's not that difficult to understand once you know what you're describing. And one of the most interesting things for me in the book was that how there is never a discussion in Western societies of white migration and white settlers.
Mhm.
And there's an exhibition at the moment at the Migration Museum, which shows what Australia did to draw white people into settler colonialism. It's the first time we've had such an exhibition. So I think, what you've done is extremely important, but it comes at the right time when there is a big and very controversial debate going on about decolonizing history, decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing literature, and so on. The thing, there are certain things I really wanted you to explain um, a little bit more, which you've done very well in the book. Ethno-nationalism um, that you describe. And there were some very surprising things, like I never knew that in only 3% in the early part of the 20th century of Jewish people, in spite of suffering what they did in Europe, went to Israel, and on the back of this ethno-nationalism or the homeland narrative. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think, the idea is that, the idea that you hear all the time is that, the Jews were being persecuted, and therefore they rose up and developed a Zionist idea and came to Palestine for refuge, and that's the Jewish story. But in fact, it isn't the Jewish story, because, like you mentioned, only about 3% of the Jews at this time, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, where millions of Jews were moving, in fact, from Russia and from Eastern Europe to the West. I mean, some came to Scotland and Britain, and others went on to Canada and mainly to the United States. Only about 3% actually came to Palestine. In other words, Zionism as an ideology, as this ethno-national ideology, um, never had much of an attraction for Jews. The vast majority of Jews, in fact, who were politically aware, were members of the Bund, which is very much of an internationalist socialist movement. Even now in the UK, there's an attempt to kind of even revive the Bund among young Jews. But that was the radical expression of Judaism. And you found it in the United States very strongly in the labor movement and in the civil rights movement and so on. That was the expression of Jews. Or Jews simply wanted to get out and get to a better life without any ideology. So that the whole idea somehow of going back to the Bible and reconstructing this kind of ethno-nationalism that was the form of nationalism of Russia and Poland and Hungary and the Eastern European countries didn't really attract the Jews very much. And in fact, the vast majority of Jews came here either as Holocaust refugees, many of which didn't have a choice but to come here, or many Mizrahi Jews from Muslim countries came. Again, it's interesting, of the Mizrahi Jews from Morocco, North Africa, Iraq, Syria, and so on, that left those countries, when they were in turmoil, the elites and the middle classes that didn't come here. They went to France, they went to Canada, they went to the UK, the United States, to a lot of other places. And it was the people, the working people and the poorer people, the rural people that didn't have a choice that ended up here. So really, Zionism, in a sense, maybe matured in this country, but it never ever really expressed the voluntary political will and outlook of the vast majority of the Jewish people. And that's something we have to be careful about. We can't accept this idea that Israel does it. It's a Jewish state, that everything does is in the name of the Jewish people. There is that, and that's the whole thrust behind this new, anti-Semitism definition, that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. That's a distortion, and in fact, there's a real reaction to that in the Jewish world. I think in the United States in particular, young Jews have really turned off to Israel at the same time that there's a reaffirmation of Jewish life, Jewish films, and Jewish art, and Jewish music, and so on. So I think the Jews of the world are making that distinction much more than the general public, and that, of course, serves the fact that Israel's able to sell Israel as the Jewish expression only serves its political purposes. It doesn't really serve the interests of the Jewish people.
Because it's true, isn't it? I talked to Kenneth Stern, who developed this definition a few months ago,
right.
and he
was against its use.
Coiled against it.
That's right.
In the way it's been misused. I mean, it's such a fantastic book. I can't do credit to it. Please read it, all of you are listening. But when did the whole you described it very well. The linkage to this was a return to a legitimate homeland. That narrative, then the colonial narrative, which is they were the civilized, and those people who were there either weren't there or were unworthy and uncivilized, and a bunch of tribes who knew nothing and were worth nothing. That there was a superior civilization. When did all that, and you gave it a name, I've forgotten the name of it. You gave it a particular name. Was this what you mean by, sorry, is this what Hasbana means to, is that what Hasbara,
which is like PR. Yeah. But all this goes back to a point that you made before about people not being so aware of decolonization, or only beginning to discover decolonization. Because, in fact, when Europeans started to move out into the world in a colonial sort of a way, one of the things that the Europeans managed to do, because they were the powerful party that writes the history, and every colonial movement, and including every settler colonial movement, is built on the idea of entitlement. There has to be some kind of a story or a narrative to explain why we're entitled to conquer India. And, it has to do with civilization. We're civilizing the natives. We're bringing development to the natives. There's all of that kind of stuff. And in settler colonialism, it usually is that the settlers find some way to justify the fact that they're taking the country, that they're taking over the country, that the country belongs to them. And that often has to do with religion. Certainly that was true in South Africa. That was true in the United States with the whole idea of manifest destiny. And it certainly was true with Zionism and the whole biblical, that's where the Bible got used as a kind of justifying our entitlement to the country. So that this idea of white entitlement has really become very much part of like you say, the backdrop to life in the world. It's become internalized by people. We talk about the discovery of America. And you see this being played out very much in the United States, where Trump and his minions really rose up against what's called critical white studies. There's a whole program called 1619 about going back and looking at the United States, and its history of racism and slavery and class warfare and all those sorts of things in a critical way, and that really went against the 1776 narrative. And so Trump established a 1776 commission of conservative scholars to try to hide that. So it's in the background. People don't think about it. It's simply part of the white history and the entitlement, the global entitlement that we feel, I think. But when in fact people of color and colonized peoples and powerless peoples do begin to push back to that, it creates a lot. I mean, it's there. It creates a lot of resistance. So behind this entitlement, which is often presented as benign, there's a real power dimension. And if you push these white people, the smiles disappear, and they'll react. You see that very strongly in the Trump reaction to all of this. So I think that's part of the problem. We have to, in a sense, I don't know, de-Europeanize, obviously, history in general. It isn't only this part of history, but but certainly Israel and Zionism have benefited from that. The book Exodus is probably the greatest example of that. You had Exodus, with this blonde-haired Holocaust survivor, who comes here, and it's his story of him and his blonde girlfriend, very Europeanized, translated into a movie. So who's in the film? Paul Newman, is the hero. The theme song is Exodus. This land is mine. God gave this land to me. Sung by Andy Williams, music by Henry Mancini. I mean, you couldn't get anything more Europeanized, Americanized, like apple pie, as the Exodus story. And that had a tremendous impact, I think, on selling Israel as kind of a variation of the American cowboy, or of the settler going into the outbanks of Australia, or the bravery and the courage, and then the Arabs, or in general the colonized people, have no names, they have no faces, they have no history. They're the gangs that you're fighting against. So you have that whole story that goes way beyond Zionism into white history, European history in general.
Let me ask you quite a difficult question. Well, first of all, I was deeply touched when you described your faith in a civil rights movement like we had with anti-apartheid. And actually during Indian independence, people forget that when Gandhi came here in his loincloth, the working class people of this country, who were losing jobs because of his boycott of British goods, came out in their thousands because they felt a deep connection to his struggles. And it was the same with the anti-apartheid movement. And I was very touched that you, and I think, and I hope you're right, that there is this around the world, a global feeling for a better civil society in Israel, Palestine. But you also then have to confront the role of the Arab nations, who have singularly failed to protect Palestinians in any way. I know Jordan harbors a lot of them, but in terms of their rights and humanity, there has been so little that Palestinians have been able to depend on. And I wanted you to talk about whether, in a sense, they have more friends outside the Arab world than within the Arab world.
Well, I think you have to make a distinction between the Arab world, the peoples, and the governments, obviously. In my book, this book and my last book, War Against the People, I talk about what I call global Palestine. Because in a way, contained within the Palestinian issue are a lot of the global issues that affect everyone in the world, from decolonization to militarization to capitalism and its predations and so on. So that, so in some ways we have to really decolonize ourselves from capitalism, which is the bottom line of the specific Palestine struggle. But, in terms of the Middle East, it's true as well. Our organization, the One Democratic State Campaign, that I wrote this book partly to get our program out as well. I have a couple chapters in the book about the political program, and I think that's the strength of our movement. It isn't only that we've come up with the one state idea. That idea has been in the air for decades. The PLO began with the one state idea. It's that we've given some substance to it. We have a 10-point program that's very detailed. And I think what we've managed to do is think through the process from the problem, which is settler colonialism, Zionist settler colonialism, to how do you get out of it, which is an inclusive form of democratic decolonization. But part of our program relates to the wider Middle East, the wider region. You can't decolonize one little country by itself. And that's where these distinctions become important, because the Arab street, the Arab people all over the world, I think, are still very connected to the Palestinians. Not only the Arab street, but I think in general, the idea that the Palestinians are kind of emblematic for peoples all over the world who are oppressed. They are like the people who are fighting not just Israel, but Israel with all its power is again connected to the global military industrial machine. People tell me, we talk about the Keystone pipeline that Biden just canceled in the Dakotas, this oil pipeline. When it was being protested by the Native Americans in the Dakotas, people tell me that if you went there when the protests are going on, there were many more Palestinian flags out there than there were American flags. When oppressed peoples all over are trying to conceptualize and visualize their struggle, the Palestinian struggle is the struggle that you glom onto, because it seems the most. And I think that's true of the Arab street as well. I think the Palestinian issue had a lot to do with the Arab Spring. And I think the Arab peoples are still very much, in Bahrain, they were, as much as they could, they demonstrated against this normalization. But of course, one of the problems we have in this region is that the governments are governments of autocratic elites that aren't real governments, that have nothing to do with the people themselves. And they're the ones that have sold out the Palestinians. So when you talk about normalization, we're normalizing with the governments and not with the people.
I've lost. Can you hear me?
Like you're having a problem.
Yeah, I've lost connection for some reason. Hang on. How do I get back on?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So go on. We can see you.
Question. Sorry.
We can see you and hear you, so it's okay.
Join. Hang on.
No, just go on. We can hear you and see you.
Okay, so I was very fascinated by, and actually very encouraged by what you describe as Palestinian steadfastness.
That's right.
You call it Samud?
Sumud.
Sumud. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, Sumud is basically a form of resistance that means steadfastness in English. In other words, we're going to resist simply by remaining on our land, remaining in our homes. And now that's the work of ICAD that Linda was talking about at the beginning, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions that I head. And that is helping Palestinians remain sumud by helping them rebuild their homes. As Israel demolishes Palestinian homes, we rebuild them as political acts of resistance. So it's a form of resistance. And then you have other forms of resistance. You have intifadas, you have demonstrations, going into political resistance, like including negotiations could be considered a form of resistance. What I'm arguing in the book is that the Palestinians, with their Israeli allies like us, have to move to a more active form and strategic form of resistance, which is, Sumud keeps them on the map, keeps them in place, doesn't allow Israel to win, but at the same time, there's no program connected to it. And you have to have a political program if you're in a political struggle. You have to get somewhere. And so I developed this idea of summoning power, that we need a strategy of summoning power. And that's, I think, what our One Democratic State campaign is doing, by formulating a political program, and then by organizing and mobilizing the only ally the Palestinians have, which is the international civil society. that will be our vehicle, like it was for the ANC in South Africa, towards liberation. So, I've tried to lay out the whole range of resistance from Sumud, which is more passive. It's powerful, but not exactly passive, because you're fighting the Israeli army and you're trying to stay in your home. It takes a lot of courage and so on, but nevertheless, towards a form of resistance that summons power in order to actually prevail and to actually get into a process of decolonization.
Finally, my quick two final questions. This very long and bitter history, how do you think it's damaged Israelis themselves? And because I remember James Baldwin, my heroes, used to say that this relationship between white and black Americans damaged both sides. Do you feel that's what's happened? And also, is there also has there been corrosion within Palestinian communities and families as well, as this endless history carries on?
For sure. It's definitely, injured or hurt the Israelis. One of the problems of settler colonialism is that you're constantly living in a state of insecurity, because everything is built on injustice. It's built on displacing other people, eliminating other people, the crimes you've committed against other people. And the people that have been colonized, the indigenous population, can never, ever reconcile with, it's not something that can be routinized. They can't say at some point, okay, you know what, you win, and let's go, because the oppression, it's constant. And so it introduces this idea of insecurity. Now, I think even in the US, where the American the dominant American population is so much overwhelmingly powerful and dominant vis-a-vis the small indigenous Native American population. But even so, when you have a Native American speak out, like in the Dakotas, or like the American Indian movement, begin to speak out and push back, it triggers off a whole reaction of insecurity in the United States, way beyond the actual power that this small group of people have. Here, where the Palestinians are the majority of the population today, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, before refugees come back, and they're still engaged in an active struggle for liberation, that certainly introduces a tremendous form of insecurity and, of course, of militarism within Israel. So that Israel hasn't been able to normalize. It tries to normalize. It's often forced happiness, like an Independence Day. People walk around with the plastic hammers and hit each other in the head, and there's dancing, but it's forced. It isn't real, because you can't relax and say, I'm in my country, I'm at home, I'm at peace. I can just walk peacefully through the countryside and enjoy the history, because you know what it's built on. Even if you don't know always consciously, you're aware constantly that there is that undercurrent, that underside of oppression and suffering that's ongoing, that will never, ever go away until decolonization takes place. Not conflict resolution, it can't be compromised, but a new society that replaces the old one, and a form of reconciliation that takes place. So I think that under situations of settler colonialism, it's true, the settlers, they don't suffer to the same degree that the oppressed suffer, but they suffer in the sense that they can never really get on with their lives in a normal way, like people would like to do.
That's a wonderful thing to end on. I'm going to go get out of this and come back in so I can actually be seen before the Q&A. I hope that's all right. So I'm going to log off and rejoin and hope that it works, okay? But that was fantastic. What a wonderful ending. And we hope we live to see that day. But I'm coming right back in. Ah, I'm back in.
See?
So we're getting questions. I don't know how they're coming to me.
You see, should be a chat on the right-hand side.
That's what I went to.
See on the bottom, it says chat?
Yeah.
Push
But
that.
it took me away. All right, there we are. So there's question from Colin Green. Actually, a comment from Kieran O'Connor and James Kelly to Linda. Brilliant. Question from Colin Green. Hello, Jeff. Dambisa Moyo, in her book Dead Aid, argued persuasively that all foreign aid hinders development, and Mark Duffield the same in Palestine, including well-meaning humanitarian NGOs. Could we be hindering progress towards decolonization, part of an international matrix of control over the Palestinians, empire light?
Yes, one of the big problems that Palestinian society faces is the process of NGOification. In other words, rather than a civil society today, I mean, there's no more PLO, and the parties are almost defunct. And instead of a civil society that's politically active, it's a collection of NGOs. Everybody's an NGO, and that really depoliticizes Palestinian society, depoliticizes the left in Israel to some degree. We were an NGO, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. It got to a point where we couldn't use the word apartheid, certainly, if we wanted donations from the UN or from the EU or from churches even. And then it got to a point that even the term occupation was getting to be problematic. And more we were being domesticated. Because where do all these humanitarian funds come from? They come from either from the governments or from the UN, and they're certainly not they don't have an interest in resolving this. They have an interest really in a sense, managing everything in a way that it doesn't disrupt the international system. So you end up being domesticated by humanitarian organizations. And even I would go on to say, even further than that, there's been a kind of a misuse of the whole idea of human rights. I think as a political solution has receded, and as the Palestinians have become disempowered politically, a lot of even Palestinian activists have fallen back to a human rights discourse, a human rights approach. We don't care if we get one state or two states or 10 states. All we want is our human rights. And that becomes the basis of BDS and a lot of campaigns. And the problem with that is there's no political program to it. BDS is not a political program. It's a tool that's efficient if it's connected to a political program. But in the absence of a political program, falling back on human rights and saying we just want our human rights is meaningless. So that I think this whole idea of this humanitarian approach, whether it's in funding NGOs or in human rights organizations, I mean, as an example, B'Tselem does wonderful work. B'Tselem is the main Israeli human rights organization. But they just came out about a week ago with a report saying that, yes, we have an apartheid state here. Well, I mean, everybody has known that. I mean, everybody has known that for 10, 15 years. But in fact, if you go back to and read my book, it was clear at the beginning, it was clear 100 years ago that Israel was heading toward apartheid. What took a human rights organization so long to use the term? And it's because they're dependent on funds from the outside. They're human rightsy. They don't want to be political. And so that shows the weakness of that approach. So I think that's what Colin was getting at. It's true all over the world. This is what Mark Duffield writes about, is that humanitarian organizations serve to domesticate peoples all over the world, even including in peacekeeping missions, rather than helping to liberate them.
There's another question here, which we have from Tipton Carlson. How are some of the families doing whose homes have been rebuilt by ICAHD?
You know, as Linda said at the beginning, Israel has demolished more than 55,000 Palestinian homes only in the occupied territory since 1967, thousands more inside Israel. And it does so, of course, the whole point of settler colonialism is to take over a country, and it's certainly to take the land. Land becomes the central issue. So you see it in Israel. You know, in 1947, 94% of the land that became Israel was owned by Palestinians. 1948, you know, 94% of the land is now owned by Israeli Jews or by the state. You see, and the same thing in the occupied territories today. 70% of the West Bank is state land, supposedly owned by Israel, and the Palestinians are locked in these little Bantustani areas of areas A and B. So taking the land, and of course, one of the ways you take the land is by demolishing people's homes and displacing them either from the country or shoving them into these little spaces of areas A and B or little enclaves in Israel or Gaza. So that, you know, probably since 1948, somewhere around 150,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished, which is a huge, you know, it has a huge impact on Palestinian society. So what we try to do as a small organization, you know, that doesn't get much help, we only get help from individual donors. We don't get help from the UN or the EU or Britain or anybody, is to rebuild homes of Palestinians that have been demolished by the Israeli government. And they're simply demolished because Israel will not give building permits to Palestinians. It has nothing to do with security. These aren't terrorists. There's nothing political about it. It's simply Israel across the board refuses building permits to Palestinians. Whether you're a citizen of Israel or you're an inhabitant of the occupied territory, it doesn't matter. And of course, you have families, you have children, you have grandchildren, and you have to, in the end, build a home, a modest home for your family on your own land without a permit. And so you get demolished. We rebuild homes. We've built close to 200 homes, you know, since we started in 1997 as political acts of resistance. Now that means nothing in humanitarian terms. I mean, what's 200 out of tens of thousands of homes? But if you think about it as 200 joint acts of resistance by Palestinians and Israelis and internationals together, then I think it really means something. So what's gone into this book that I wrote now, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, is not only an academic analysis, but it's really based on my years of being out there with the Palestinians and struggling and really understanding the dynamics. I mean, I don't think I could have written this book sitting in a library, just having a pile of books. I mean, there's a lot of literature on settler colonialism, but you only get it. You only begin to put these things together, these abstract concepts together, once you're out in the field. That's the anthropology of what I do, you know, as an anthropologist. This coming together of what's happening on the ground to people, making sense of it, and then dipping into the academic literature in order to get those concepts that help to explain it.
And a question from ICAHD UK. How do you see the way forward to acceptance of the one-state solution among the political elite?
You know, it's a real issue. I mean, it was true with the ANC in South Africa as well. How do you liberate a country without the support of the elites, without the support of your own government? You think of South Africa, they certainly didn't have the support of apartheid governments. They didn't have the support of the dominant white population and the power elites there, and they didn't have the support of international governments. Thatcher called Mandela a terrorist. Reagan called him a terrorist. Certainly a liberation movement did not have much traction among governments in the West. Certainly, what do you do? And I think that's the dilemma the Palestinians have as well. They have to fight a dominant Israeli population. They have to fight a dominant Israeli government. They have to fight governments that support Israel, which are the vast majority of governments in the world. And they all even have to fight their own Palestinian Authority, which is set up by Israel and is kind of a collaborationist regime. So where do you start? And what we're trying to advocate for is a kind of a civil society struggle like the ANC did in South Africa. What the ANC said was our only allies are the churches out there, religious communities, universities, intellectuals, political organizations, trade unions, the people in all their different forms. And the good news is that the Palestinians have that infrastructure as well. It's in place already. You have hundreds of organizations around the world that are very committed to the Palestinian struggle. You've got in the UK, not only ICAD UK of Linda, you've got the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, you've got a lot of church groups. I mean, there's a lot all over the world, there's Palestinian. I think the Palestinian issue has achieved the level of significance of the anti-apartheid struggle in the world. But what we're missing, again, is a political program. Because you can have all the sympathy and all the solidarity in the world, but unless you have a program that you're advocating for, you're powerless, you see? And that's what we're trying to insert. And we believe that if we, the One Democratic State campaign, can insert a political program and mobilize Palestinians around it, we can then go out and mobilize the civil society around it, and that will create pressures on governments to begin to change their policies. So we believe that liberation is possible, and we have more power than we're aware of. Israel's not as strong. It goes back to your question about the Arab world. Israel's very strong with governments, because it sells governments military wares and technologies of repression and security stuff. Of course it's popular. But it's not popular. I think Israel has lost in the court of public opinion, world over. And that's why you've got this anti-Semitism campaigns. You felt that with what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, this whole shrillness about BDS, because Israel is really panicking. So I think if we build on that and mobilize civil society around the world, I really do think we can replicate the success that the ANC had.
So we have a question from Chris. How might Palestinian refugees' right to return be facilitated in a single democratic state?
Well, at the beginning of our political program, we talk about the right of the Palestinian refugees to return and be reintegrated. It's not only that they return. Where are they going to return to? How are they going to be reintegrated into society? It doesn't help if they return and become a permanent underclass, so that all that's really a part of our program. And we're basing our political program on the idea of a democratic state based on equal rights of all its citizens. Now that's not only a good recipe for giving everyone an equal share, an equal part of the country and bringing people together, but by creating the idea of citizenship, it goes beyond the right of return. I mean, refugees have the right of return. Okay. Beyond that, they're also our citizens. You don't lose your citizenship because you flee a country during a war, or certainly if you're driven out of a country during a war, you don't lose. So they're still our citizens. And the whole idea is we want you to come home and reclaim the citizenship that you never lost. So it adds another level to this idea of return. It isn't only return because they have a right to return, it's a return because there are people and they should come home. And as part of the ingathering, and then we have to work again on how to reintegrate them. There's a Palestinian geographer named Salman Abu Sita who's done very interesting work on this, and he's found that 85% of the land taken from the Palestinians in 1948 is still available. Israel never built on it. It's either agricultural land, that was taken over by the kibbutzim or moshavim, or it's under national parks, so that in fact refugees can come back. And there's a whole process. There's an organization called Zochrot, which means return, an Israeli organization of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel that has a whole program of young Palestinian urban planners that have planned new communities for refugees. So you're not coming back, to some old house somewhere. You're coming back to a modern community built in the area where you come from. So you're not going to your particular home, true, which probably doesn't exist anymore, but you can go back to the part of the country you come to, live in a community that's modern with an infrastructure and an economy, and go begin to move through the process of becoming reoriented. The tremendous trauma these people have gone to, reoriented into the new society. So like I said, I think, and it's reflected hopefully in my book, we've really thought through this whole process from the beginning to the end.
So there's a very good question from Kumi. If the one state reality seems to be gaining traction, what happens next? What should we be doing as activists?
Well, look, first of all, this has to be a Palestinian initiative. And to be honest, we're still in the stage of bringing the Palestinians on board. I mean, this is a Palestinian struggle. I am a junior partner to this, but I'm not Palestinian. I can't speak for the Palestinians, and none of us can. So they have to come on board, and that's not easy because, Palestinians are, again, a colonized people. They're struggling inside Israel. They're certainly struggling for their very civil rights, and they're struggling economically. In the occupied territories, they're struggling for their very survival. They're barely holding on. They have not only the Israeli government and army against them, but their own Palestinian Authority. So that, a lot of them are scared. They don't have that mental political space to go on to another struggle. They're trying to survive. And of course, there's this whole issue of, is this really doable? And Palestinians don't have the luxury of investing in another political struggle that has no chance of success. So our job is, first of all, to convince them that there is a chance of success. And there's two reasons, particularly why that's true. One is that, again, this whole infrastructure of support for Palestinians exists internationally. They have international support, not of governments yet, but certainly of the people. And secondly, there already is one state. Between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, de facto, there already is one apartheid state under the control of Israel. So that, in a way, it's a very simple kind of a struggle. It's simply transforming the single state that Israel created, which is an apartheid state that exists today, into a single democracy inclusive of everyone, including refugees. So it's, even if you put it that way, it's even hard for people to disagree with. Are you going to go against democracy? You're going to go against inclusiveness? You're going to support apartheid? I mean, when you lay it out that way, it makes it's very compelling. And so I think if we can convince the Palestinian people here and abroad, and in the camps, of course, that this is not utopian, and if we have a program and we organize and we have a strategy, we can really succeed with our international partners. then I think we're on the way. And then what we have to do is mobilize all of you. So basically, what you have to do as the international civil society is what you're doing: BDS, campaigning, lobbying, writing, speaking out, everything you're doing, you have to do, but it's all connected to a political program. It isn't just a standalone. We have a lobby day with parliamentarians, and then we do a BDS against this, and we do a demonstration here or there, or just react. But all the things that we're doing, if they're connected to a political program and they're connected to advocacy and supporting the Palestinian cause led by the Palestinians, that's what creates that liberation dynamic that I believe could succeed.
Okay, there's one. How much time do we have? Can somebody give me a time check? Anybody? 10 minutes. Okay. A question from.
That's a half an answer for me.
That was 10 minutes. What could be the practical early steps? It's a really important question. To dissolve Jewish-Israeli fear of the other based on imposed militaristic mindset in favor of an inclusive humanitarian outlook. And maybe I'll add a bit more to that. How many Israelis at the moment are going with this idea? Or do you get the sense it's catching on in Israel?
You want their names?
The,
there's about 5 of them that I can name off right away. No, I tell you what the problem is, and it's again the same problem that he had in South Africa. The Israeli Jews are not going to go there voluntarily. They're not. I mean, they're a population that not only feels entitled to the country, but is enjoying this situation. They're the dominant population. They have all the benefits. You can even ask the opposite question: what would be their motivation in dismantling their apartheid regime, their colonial regime? There's no real motivation for them to do that they can see. And I'll go even further and say the whole Palestinian issue has become a non-issue in Israel. If I would say to you, there was a terrible earthquake in Nepal a couple of years ago, you'd say, oh, yeah, well, I know that, but you're not doing anything about it because it's so removed from your life. And that's what Israel's done with the Palestinians. It's made them so removed from the everyday life of Israelis that today feel a great sense of personal security, that it's become a non-issue. It's as abstract as Nepal. So that what we have to really do is take into account that we don't have support in Israel, and that Israelis are not going to be proactive partners. A few Israelis will, but the vast majority not. And instead of taking that as an obstacle, we have to take that as a challenge. And what's happened, even among Palestinians, is that you talked in the beginning about the colonization of the mind. That's happened in a way. You get many Palestinians, including leaders in the Palestinian Authority, that'll say, well, you can't have a two-state solution because the Israelis will never allow it. So they've already internalized that whatever they can get is all that Israel would agree to. They're letting Israel determine the parameters of their liberation. You can't do that. And so you have to say, okay, we realize that the Israeli Jews are not going to actively dismantle their colonial system. How do we work around that? And that's where I got into the whole discussion about bypassing the Israeli public without any expectations and going directly to the international civil society in order to create that dynamic of liberation.
So Brittany wants to know, what does a Biden administration mean for the prospects of a one-state solution?
It means nothing. Biden would never go for a one-state solution. Biden is a very strong Zionist. He's always been very, very close to Israel, and Kamala Harris as well. We have to understand, the Republicans, I mean, besides Trump, and maybe before that, until the Christian right became strong in the Republican Party in the US, Republicans were more critical of Israel than Democrats were. During Eisenhower's time, when Israel did the Sinai War with you guys and France, Eisenhower said to Ben Gurion, if you don't get out of Sinai by tomorrow, we're going to cut off all diplomatic ties with you, Israel. George Bush, the father, withheld $10 billion of loan guarantees for Israel unless they stopped building settlements. The Republicans, who have always been vaguely anti-Semitic, actually in their country clubs, and who are committed to oil and business and so on, have always been more critical of, and Jews don't vote Republican, have always been more critical of Israel until the rise of the Christian right. That changed things. So the Democrats have always been super pro-Israel from the very beginning, from Harry Truman on, and that's the problem. And you have that problem with this whole idea of PEP, progressive except Palestine, and that's a real problem that we have to face. I think young people who are thinking in terms of human rights and of liberation and so on, especially if we can connect up the Palestine issue, as we're trying to do, with Black Lives Matter and with issues of race and class in the UK, and urban gentrification movements, all sorts of things like that. If we can begin to make those connections, then I think we can build a very strong base, in a way, maybe within both the Democratic Party, the Labour Party, and so on. I think in the Labour Party, you see that very well in Britain. I think people are really trying to find a way to it's hard to start a new Labour Party, but to this whole struggle within Labour as well. So those tensions are there. And again, the global Palestine, the idea is that Palestine, linked to other issues, can release kind of a radicalism that's there among young people that isn't expressed in the party structures. That it's going to have to find over time new forms of expression.
Final question. Is there any prospect, and it's from Andrew Smith, of a rapprochement between the PA and Hamas, which might aid a unified approach to decolonization?
I mean, they've talked about rapprochement. I don't see it. As a matter of fact, Hamas just decided that it's not going to go together with Fatah in the elections that are scheduled. I don't know if they're really going to happen. But they're all. I mean, the PA is a dead end today. Fatah really lost it, and the PA lost it when they basically dismantled the PLO and cut off the refugees and Palestinians from inside Israel and Palestinians from abroad, and only became representative of the occupied territories, and then lost Gaza, and have become committed since the 1970s to the two-state idea. So they're stuck in this conflict negotiation sort of thing, in a non-starter situation in a way. The problem we have, and maybe we'll end on this. The problem we have is that the PLO is gone, so there is no more Palestinian national leadership. But there's still an idea that there is somehow a national leadership, and our organization is basically a civil society organization coming from the grassroots. Well, a lot of the people understand that if the grassroots don't organize and begin to work politically, nothing's going to happen from above. But at the same time, they don't feel they have a mandate, because they feel, well, we're just the people. Where's our national leadership? So this idea that there's a Palestinian national leadership that's only legitimate agency for struggle that we have to support is holding them back, because in fact it's a myth. It doesn't exist anymore. And so I think people here we're in the process, I think, of empowering the people to begin to say, yes, we do have the right to rise up, even against our own leadership, and for our liberation.
Jeff, thank you so much. That was astounding, and the book
Thank
is
you.
extraordinary. How much you fact in. It's a manifesto, it's an analysis, it's inspirational, it's energetic, and stay well, stay safe, and thank you from all of us here, but also millions of others for whom you fight. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin. I enjoyed it.